Jennifer, who is a lawyer who has been trained by our Homeland Security, those of you that heard Amy Allen speak, to understand and train in forensic interviewing. So when we do our civilian first responder training, we have Jennifer do our forensic interviewing. And that's basically how to ask questions without shutting a survivor, a victim down or making them feel shame, because the goal is to get facts, not not trigger them, not make them feel judged in any way, because the bottom line is you need the facts in order to get a case. You can get their feelings, you can get all of that, and those are important for the counseling and healing. But in the interviewing phase where you're trying to collect data, so today we had a 911 call, we have them every day. Some days we have 6 or 7 a day, and trying to get the facts. They kept saying that there was, you know, abuse, but they wouldn't describe the abuse. They wouldn't say what made them think there was the abuse, that kind of thing. So we don't question that there's abuse, but they've got to give you actionable data. So tonight I've asked Jennifer just to walk us through a PowerPoint that she uses when she does this training. And throughout that, we will, you know, take your questions. And we will, if it's appropriate, I'll interrupt her and address it right then, or we'll save them to the end. And I will be taking notes as well, so that I will keep track of your, the audience questions, so that Jennifer can just kind of take off. Jennifer, where are you on my screen? I don't know where she went. She's one of the ones I can't see right now. Oh, there you are. Okay, so Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm just excited for the world of women at risk and war to hear from someone other than me. And so welcome, and thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Becky, I appreciate it. If we just want to go ahead and start the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so it's kind of entitled Change the Mindset, and we can go to the second slide. And so this is just kind of a story to introduce why we call it Change the Mindset. So you hear something crash, you go into a room and there's a mess of broken dishes and spilled food. So you're automatically irritated. You look around, you're like, what happened here? And you see, a kid is standing there. You immediately start being accusatory. You ask them, what were you doing? Why are you messing around in the kitchen? Why did you do this? You just broke all of our dishes. This food is expensive. The child leaves crying. They're wounded. They're crushed. Later, you hear from someone else what the real story was. They were simply trying to cook you breakfast. They accidentally dropped the bowl. And if you had simply just asked the right questions instead of responding and listened before you spoke, then you could have gotten the right story. And so that's kind of where we want to go with this, is learn to change your mindset in order to get some life-saving information. And we can go to the next slide.
Number 3, Angel, thanks.
So this is just a quote from Brian Barlow, a detective. The trauma survivor often won't be able to answer who, what, when, where, why, and how, because that requires the brain to engage the prefrontal cortex, which was extremely overloaded at the time of the trauma. Therefore, you cannot treat a trauma survivor as witnesses to their own trauma, which sounds a little bit weird, but as we kind of go through this, this makes more sense. Rather, they experience the trauma. So you need to ask sensory, emotional, and experiential questions. And we can go to slide number 4. And this is just kind of a slide that talks about trauma, kind of what it is, little or no memories, dissociation, depression. Like, you guys can kind of read through what some of these talk about. Understanding the way trauma affects people's thoughts and behaviors is key. It is important to note that not all view their experiences as traumatic, and not always the right way or the same way. A study done on trafficked adults in St. Louis in 2017 found that some women capitalized their experiences as traumatic, but some only said it was embarrassing, but not traumatic, and some just thought it was something that occurred. Now, this is going to kind of be our backdrop as we continue to progress through these slides, is trauma can create fight, freeze, or flight responses. And an individual experiencing a trauma trigger will react according to the hardwiring of his or her brain, which is referred to as the trauma brain, with a tendency to become aggressive or defensive, or to become non-responsive, in order to avoid the trauma situation.
So I'm gonna interrupt you 1 second, and I'm gonna ask if one of our survivors who's on here wants to just give an example. I'm thinking of the disassociation. If they don't have to speak up. Otherwise, I will. You know who I'm talking to. But just give an example of some of these so that people understand when you've been through trauma, these are all very typical responses. Some of them are very obvious, numbing, and people may do that with alcohol or drugs or something. But if one of my survivors wants to speak to disassociation, go ahead and unmute yourself and do that.
Hi, Becky.
Hello.
Well, first of all, I just want to say this is a really great topic to be doing tonight. I'm just going to share this real quick. I got a phone call at about 10 o'clock on Saturday, and it was a younger girl. She called me and just told me this stuff, and I was like deer in the headlights, and I was like, wait a minute, I heard this talk, and I knew how to talk her through this conversation using the correct terminology and without being, aggressive and things like that. And so what we're talking about tonight is very important. So first of all, I just wanted to say that. But second of all, yes. So, all these things are pretty common, I would say. I feel like it was very numbing, didn't cry. I would actually laugh just because, you don't really know how to handle those emotions. So you just kind of laugh. So that, I feel like that sometimes, self-blaming, obviously, because everyone always blames themselves because that's what they were told. Nightmares, obviously, I have those a lot. I sleep on the floor because of that. So I would say those are definitely some of the bigger ones that I went through.
So I'm going to just speak to the disassociation one. Yes, I do. Go ahead, Donna. I was thinking of you. Go ahead. You have to turn your mic on. There you go.
Okay. I have struggled with it for a while. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Sorry about this. Okay.
Yes.
I have the headphone mic on. That's why I was asking. I've struggled with disassociating in different mini forms. Not being there when doing the self-destructive behaviors.
Yep.
Actually, you've seen different stages of it.
Mm-hmm.
I can totally disassociate and continue on with everything that's going on around me, and nobody can tell unless you've gotten to know who I am and have been around enough.
Mm-hmm.
I can disassociate, and if I need to be in a situation, put myself in situations, say in the beginning of my relationship with my husband, and things got intimate there. We disassociated a lot to get through the beginning of that even. But just growing up, it was a protective mechanism to disassociate with the different levels of the abuse even going on.
So Donna brings up a very transparent point that often survivors of sexual abuse and or human trafficking, either one, their body will zone out that's called one way of looking at disassociation, because they can't handle what's happening to them, especially when they're children. And in Donna's case, she was. And so you have no power over the circumstances. So it's almost like an out of body thing where you like just, you check out. And time again, survivors will say it's almost like they're hovering over in the room over what's happening. And that is the body's way of protecting itself. So the way you would see this in a person, if it's your family member or you're talking to a friend and they just suddenly they're animated, and then suddenly they just get this blank look on their face, and it's like, knock, knock, who's in there? That's disassociation. They're either reliving the trauma or they've checked out in order to handle the trauma. So when you're asking a question and you get that sudden blank look, or maybe something triggers them, maybe let's say a cop walks by and it's a trigger, and so they just shut down. So I just wanted to give you, we'll go back to Jen now, but I just wanted to give you some examples of this picture here. I mean, obviously headaches and pain and eating disorders, all those kinds of things are intuitive to all of us, but some of these words like disassociation isn't. And so I just wanted to let some survivors speak to those. And so we'll go back to Jen now, and go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And kind of along, disassociation, when, like Becky was describing, when the trauma is actually occurring, like your body and your brain can't handle it. So it starts to shut down. It's trying to protect itself. And so as it translates to an interview, you may only get bits and pieces of information at a time. When you're trying to speak to someone, they're not going to be able to give you a linear story, which can tend to be super frustrating. Like Becky said, I'm an attorney. And so when I go into a deposition or I'm going in to meet with someone, I have a clear objective, agenda, whatever it looks like. And so if they're not following along these things that make a clear linear sense, they're lying. And then I can go back and attack them on the lie. But when you're going into a trauma interview or a forensic interview and somebody is just giving you pieces of information, the most important thing I think to remember from that is that does not mean they're lying. It means that their brain is only able to pull up certain pieces of information at a time because it's all they're able to handle at that time. We can go to the next slide. And so now we're going to talk about, there's three kind of main points or things for an interview. So one is sight. We can go to the next slide. 2 is rapport. And the next slide. And then 3 is what to ask and what to avoid. Okay, so going to the next slide. So kind of talking about an interview and the sight. So one of the things that you really want to keep in mind, and what Becky had talked about at the outset, is you don't want to trigger someone. You don't want to re-victimize them. So the criminal justice and victim services systems can inadvertently re-traumatize. Key triggers to re-traumatization include feeling a lack of control, experiencing unexpected change, feeling threatened or attacked, feeling vulnerable or frightened, and feeling shame. And so kind of when you're thinking about an interview, some of it seems pretty obvious. You want a private area away from a lot of people in the public. You want non-threatening and neutral. You're not trying to get the upper hand, and you think of like a Law and Order, if you guys have watched that, like there's a reason that they bring him into this creepy room and they leave him in there for hours, and it's, dark, and then they'll flash a bright light at him, or, things like that. They're trying to elicit specific information, but that's a great way to shut down a victim or a survivor. So you want to get it to where the interviewee is the most comfortable, and if possible, let them select the location. You really want to let them feel like they can trust you and open up to you. So some locations to consider: away from police station, if possible, Oh, and one thing I wanted to kind of say to this, when Becky was talking about civilian first responder training, like this applies, I think, to every single person in every aspect of life. If you're a doctor, if you're a teacher, if you're a lawyer, if you're a clerk, if you work at a hotel, I mean, just about anywhere you work, you can come into contact with someone. So when you leave these meetings and you're going about your daily life, go ahead and start considering where you might take someone if you think that they are a victim in order to get an interview with them. Where would be a great interview location in your area of work where you think that you might be able to get the best information from them? Okay, the next slide. Oh, and so this was the last slide. I forgot I was going to tell this story. So I remember I was reading this story about this, they felt this woman had been trafficked and she had been rescued, and they had set up the interview. It was supposed to be at the police station. They scheduled the time. It was early in the morning. The detective was there. He was actually an FBI agent, not a detective. And so they schedule it and she doesn't show up. So they're like, are you kidding me? They're super frustrated. They're like, we're trying to help you. We're trying to, do what we can, and you're not showing up. So they reschedule it. She misses it again. So they can't figure out what's going on. So actually what had occurred was a victim's advocate went out and met with her, and come to find out that she wasn't getting any sleep. Like, she was still so traumatized that she was not getting sleep. It was not easy for her to get up in the morning. So an early morning meeting time was not helpful to her at all. And then probably the most important thing they found out was that the agent reminded her of her trafficker. So obviously she doesn't want to get up early in the morning when she hasn't slept and go meet with someone who reminded her of the person who had trafficked and abused her for 5 years. I think the thing to keep in mind is that you need to do what makes the victim comfortable. And so once they did this and they set a later afternoon meeting with a female agent, she showed up, and it made the world of difference for her. So now we're going to talk about establishing rapport. And so you want to identify everyone in the room, identify the purpose of the meeting, identify if they have any sort of physical needs, let them take breaks. Like even if I'm taking a deposition, one of the first things I say leading into it is, if you need to take a break, let me know. We're not here for a marathon session. When you're interviewing a victim, are they hungry? Are they thirsty? Depending on at what point you're meeting with them, they might not have eaten. They might need something to drink, like some of those kind of basic things to keep in mind. We can go to the next slide. So the choice of words we use and the way we structure our questions can make a substantial difference between building a rapport with the victim and destroying their trust in you. Rather than thinking, what's wrong, why was he there, or what was she wearing, instead think, what happened to her? And that's in relation to the victims themselves. Like, you don't need to think, this is one thing that Becky was talking about, and it struck me, and I've said it to a lot of people since leaving after a seminar in Florida, is get away from the victim shaming, get away from victim blaming. Becky said, if somebody wants to walk down the street naked, it's probably not the best idea, but that does not give somebody the right to put a hand on them. So
I actually said they're stupid, but that still gives nobody the right to lay a finger.
So that's what this is. Like, you tend to go into a meeting or something like that, and if you have some preconceived notions about, well, why were you there? Why were you out late that night? Why are you in that part of town? Why were you wearing that? But you want to get their story. And if you have the other mindset, they're not going to feel that they can trust you, and they're not going to open up to you, and you're not going to be able to get any information. You want to try and just think about what happened to him or her. The other thing is use open-ended questions instead of leading questions, because leading questions suggest the answer. You want to let them tell your story. If you are just trying to get bullet point specific information, they're not going to talk to you, and you're going to miss their story, because again, they can't give it to you in bullet points. They can't give it to you piece by piece. One of the other important things is that when you're trying to talk to them, you want to talk and not just about what happened to them, but try and get some information about what kind of food do they like? What do they, what do they enjoy watching or doing? Or do they like books? Do they, you want to build a rapport with them. Let them know about yourself. I'm Jennifer. I have 3 kids. I work as an attorney. I like to run. I used to do triathlons and then I got old, so I don't do those anymore. You really want to try and talk to them about life things, not just focus on what is happening or what has happened to them. So the next slide. So again, trust, trust, trust. They have to feel safe with you. You want to build the rapport, and this takes time and patience. One thing that we talk about is you don't want to re-victimize. And so it's kind of you have to let the victim lead the interview, lead the number of meetings. You don't ever want to make it a marathon, but you also don't want to have to come back 25 times to tell you their story. Because 1, you're re-victimizing them. And then 2, you may also get different pieces of information at each time. And then law enforcement later trying to put it together and be like, well, this information doesn't match. So obviously they were lying, or, different things like that. So let them be in charge of kind of how it's going and the number of times you need to keep coming back. So again, multiple contacts and multiple interviews may be needed. Have patience. Never expect them to give you all or hardly all of the story in that very first interview. Depending on at what point you're finding them, you may get very little information out of them, just kind of depending on where they are. The first few meetings, you want to gain their trust and build rapport, and you will most likely get tiny bits of information which grow little by time. And again, to go back to the trauma and the dissociation, it's not their responsibility to build the story for you. It's your responsibility to listen, build rapport, and then, write it down, take notes, do what needs to be done to be able to put the pieces together later. So the next slide. Make them comfortable. Again, this, just telling them, I'll meet with you as many times as it takes. You're the one in control. You don't have to tell me anything that you don't want to tell me. You also want to use like a conversational approach. You don't want to do like rapid fire questions. Effects of trauma can influence behavior of a victim during an interview. Memory loss, lack of focus, emotional reactivity, and multiple versions of a story can all be signs of trauma. Interviewers should be familiar with the signs of trauma and not assume that they are evading the truth. For example, lack of linear memory is often the sign of trauma. You want to ask, what else happened instead of what happened next. This will allow them to focus on the elements and that what happened to them rather than trying to feed them information. And I'll go ahead and say it now because I was going to do kind of an end all, but I might forget to say it at the end. But there are 2 words that you always want to get rid of and you never want to use when you're trying to interview someone. And it's the why and you. And that's super important, and we call those blaming words. And the reason we call those blaming words is because if you are talking to someone, and this is a true life story. And I mean, it's not, I have a daughter, she is in 8th grade, and there's a little boy who keeps grabbing multiple girls' bottoms. And so, of course, my sons were like, why don't you just turn around and punch him in the face? Well, so then I talked to the boys later and I was like, you can't talk to her like that or anyone else like that because it automatically makes them feel that they did something wrong. So if you're talking to someone and you're interviewing a victim, you want to just say what happened next. Like if you are talking to them and they say, yeah, we went to the hotel room and then he told me to take off his clothes. And if you say, what did you do? Or what did you say? Then she's automatically going to think, oh, I made a mistake or it's my fault because I didn't say anything. A lot of times your body is not able to respond the way that you think it's going to during a time of trauma. And so that makes them think that they did something wrong, and it's going to make them shut down and not talk as much as they ordinarily would. So you want to get rid of the why and the you, the blaming words. We can go to the next slide. Or Becky, did you have anything else to say on the why and the you?
Well, I want to give you, I want to talk about that a little bit, because I think as parents, for sure, you know, interviewing law enforcement, medical professionals, but especially parents, if something happens, your child's worst nightmare and that your worst nightmare, and they come to you and tell you, and you say something like, why were you out at that time of night? Why did you go on a date with that guy? Why were you wearing that? The why? That implies that she could have done something about it, which there's a place for that conversation, but it's not in the moment of crisis. It implies they had agency. And the whole point of fight, flight, and freeze is that we often freeze in the face of crisis. I know this because I went through PTSD, not sexual abuse, but I grew up in a war zone as an American in Pakistan, in a Muslim country. And my response to crisis is to freeze. And so if you teach your kids, you should scream, or why didn't you scream? Why didn't you punch him in the face? You're implying that they should have had the fight response, not the flight or the freeze. And our bodies, you know, our response is the way we're made and wired. So you just automatically, instinctively respond in one of those three ways. And so there's nothing wrong with not screaming and yelling, because I mean, you want a kid to scream and yell for sure, but in the moment you may not, because you may, and that's actually a healthy response. It's your body protecting itself. So for sure, teach your kids to scream and fight and all of that, but just know that if they don't, be careful that you don't shame them for that, because it's equally normal to run away or to just freeze in the spot, because the body just freaks out and has to protect itself. And so the why question, just get rid of that from your vocabulary for the rest of your life. Use what. But then you can't say, what did you do? The next word to get rid of is you, because what did you do when they scared you to death and you froze implies they could have done something. And the whole point of abuse is the person thinks in the moment they don't have, if they're in the freeze mode, that they don't have agency. So you're implying they should have done something, and maybe they should have, but at that point, who cares? You're just trying to solve the problem. So instead of saying what should you, like Jen said, instead of saying what did you do then, you should say what happened next. Because the whole problem with human trafficking is force, coercion, and fraud, which is the legal definition. They're being forced, they're being coerced, or they're being defrauded, and they may not have agency. So at that moment, all you're trying to do is solve the problem, get to the facts. If you judge them in some way, they're going to shut down. You're not going to get the facts, and your goal is to get the facts. There's feelings and all that are important, and they will come later. But in the moment, the why and the you are really not at all helpful. So whenever you're talking to somebody who's in trouble, just don't let yourself say why. Don't let yourself say you. Force yourself to say what happened, and keep it very generic, because your goal is to help, I hope. And in that case, you need to leave those two words out, because as she said, those are very shaming words. And of course, you know, we need to raise our children to be wise as serpents, but in the moment, Jennifer telling her daughter that I would like her to punch that boy in the face too, but that may not be how she's wired. And so the fact that she even told her family she should be rewarded and cheered, and, you know, the whole family should start clapping that she told them, because that took courage for a girl who shuts down or a boy, by the way. Boys do the same, fight, flight, freeze. And by the way, there's one fourth response we've learned to trauma, and that is bond. So the little girl or boy who's too clingy, sometimes because of the chemistry of trauma, we will actually bond to the actual abuse, and that's another conversation. So there's somebody who has a question, and I can't see your hands because I can only see a couple of the 30, 40 hands, but either type it so I can see it and I'll bring it up, or unmute your microphone and let me know. But I'm watching for questions on the side and responding either personally to them as they ask them or by interrupting.
Can I say something quickly then? I want to thank you
Sure.
for what you said. You just freed my soul from 47 years of internalizing the words. It doesn't make sense. Why did you wear that? So it does when it doesn't make sense to other people, when you don't know what the word trafficking means. It took me until I did work with your organization. I hadn't connected that the intent behind everything that happened to me was human trafficking. I didn't know what the word meant. I thought they meant there was traffic outside. So that you can't presume but the internal damage of those words, the accusations, the needing a safety net when it's not there, but particularly it doesn't make sense. And the whys, and the why did you wear that? I can't thank you enough for what you have just so eloquently stated. You would think it would be common sense and that human beings would be, I don't know, less, whatever. But it's like having a loaded gun, those words, it's how it feels. And you internalize them forever till someone like you does this and releases. So I'm eternally grateful to you. Thank you.
See, your words are, I don't even know what to say because I'm sitting here crying. First of all, I just want to thank you for having the courage to say what you just said, because you just gave life to a conversation that was a little academic, and you just proved the worth of it. And sadly, in our families and homes, law enforcement, every culture of the world, we ask the why. We even asked why of God, you know, and we ask that why all the time. And I had a mother of a survivor tell me, as I sat with her in a restaurant with her daughter, she said, well, Becky, I happened to be wearing a turtleneck that day. She said, well, if she had dressed like you, this would never have happened. And I said, oh, ma'am, you do not want to go there with me. I grew up with the Taliban. And if you go down that road, you're going to end up wearing a veil with only your eyes showing, and then they'll throw acid at your eyes, because how dare you have eyeballs? And they'll hit you with sticks on your ankles because your high heels are clicking on the road. So I said, don't you go there with me. If your daughter like I said, runs down that street stark naked, that's not really very smart of her, but nobody has the right to lay a finger on her. And so those kind of shaming things do us no good whatsoever. And so Dee, you just made my day. I applaud you. I honor you for sticking with it all these years. And I just, I want you to, my email for all of you, by the way, is Becky, BECKY, at war, WAR, international spelled out, .org. And if you want to write me personally and tell me things, please feel free to do that. And Dee, I would be happy to talk to you personally and email back and forth. And so I'm not going to take the time now, but I just wish right now that you were sitting right here and I could give you a hug and wrap my arms around you and tell you that you are my hero. So thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage, and I honor you for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Jennifer. Keep
Okay,
going, girl.
it's kind of a story with that. I mean, just to go back to highlight how important it is to not victim shame and how it just doesn't make any sense. Like you hear the story about somebody who, a famous, I think it was a Dallas football player, and his house was robbed and a bunch of stuff was taken, like a Super Bowl ring. There's this big news story on it. And everyone's like, that is horrible. Who would do that? That's ridiculous, blah, 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 blah. But what you didn't hear in the news story was like, well, why did he leave his door unlocked? What did he do? What part did he have to blame in this? Like, it's just, we try to separate things between trafficking and sexual abuse and sexual exploitation as it's the victim's fault. And surely they did something that deserved this. Surely they did something. So again, keep that in mind when you're speaking with someone. It's not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong. And you really want to be careful with the words that you choose, that you're not shutting them down or further victimizing them, further shaming them, and further traumatizing them. So you kind of want to begin with non-threatening questions. Just like I said, you introduce yourself and then see if you can get their name, see if they had any aliases, try and get their date of birth, their place of birth, and address. The reason that this is important is because you may not know from where that person came. And so if you can try and get some of that basic personal information when you're interviewing them, it may help to, obviously locate from where they came, what happened to them, how many times they were trafficked, some things like that. But again, if they can't provide all of that to you, it's okay. They're not being dishonest or not forthcoming. They're just not able to at that time. And again, you want to ask some family information, see if you can figure out if they had parents, see if they had siblings, did they have children? And some of this will kind of also help you highlight if they, how they were trafficked or how they were a victim. Because if you're speaking with someone who should probably be in school and they tell you they live in a house with a bunch of kids, but they don't know any of their names, that's a problem. And so that's something that can be provided to law enforcement that they can look into further, because this may not be an isolated incident of one single trafficking victim. We can go to the next slide. You want to try and figure out, how did she get to where you found her or him? Depending on where you're interviewing them, if it's at a school or a hospital or, kind of where you're interviewing them, how did you get to where you found them? Because that's going to be some important information if they can talk about if it was a car or a truck or, I have no idea. You want to try and figure out how she got there and see if, you can eventually piece back from where she started. The next slide.
That may also assume that it was in a place, not their bedroom. And so some victims, are sold. In the case of Donna, it happened in her own home. In the case of Vanessa, it happened in her own home. Her mother was selling her from age 3 to 11. So where it happened may come out naturally, or in this case, this is if you're rescuing somebody who's on the run or that kind of thing, where the location matters, or at least where they were sold from will tell you maybe about the trafficker.
And then you kind of want to figure out, how they were recruited. How old was she when she was first targeted? What was she promised? How did they convince her to leave? Was she told she would owe money or her family would be in danger? A lot of these questions, like how old was she when she was first targeted? Unfortunately, we live in a very digital age where most of us are just kind of crawling out of this COVID time where we were at home, our kids were at home, everything was online. The internet's great. Amazon drops stuff at your door within, maybe a day, but also the explosion of the internet, the explosion of all sorts of these gaming sites and websites has really led to an explosion of human trafficking. And it just makes it so much easier for traffickers to get to people. There's little to no accountability to them, and it's so easy for them to target people. So you want to try and figure out how old was she, and then what was she promised. This can kind of tie to, was she in a relationship with someone and she was promised that, you know, we'll go and we'll live together and I'll take care of you, and we'll be boyfriend and girlfriend, we'll be husband and wife, whatever that looks like, and then they ultimately are trafficked. Or were they just promised that you can have this job and this will be great for you, and then ultimately it's, well, you have to sell yourself in order to, or I'm going to beat you, or whatever it looks like. Or how did they convince her to leave? A lot of times when you talk to somebody, when you talk to a lot of the people who do the trafficking, one of the examples that they give is that if they'll go to a mall and they'll talk to a group of girls and they'll say, they'll, see, oh, I like your shirt, you look really pretty today. And if a girl just like, whoa, it's creepy, and they keep going, then they just move on. But if she kind of looks and is like, oh, thank you, then he might follow her for a little bit longer to see if that's someone he thinks is worth trying to continue to pursue in order to traffic. Or if he finds one that says, oh, thank you so much, are you sure? I wasn't sure, it looked good on me. The reason they do that is they want to seize the weakness. If they think that they can find someone who is weak or who is vulnerable or who is in a bad position, that's who they want to target and that's who they want to go after. The last one was she told she would owe money or her family would be in danger. Those are important things. There was a thing, I don't know, a year or two ago where they were going after single women. Some of them were moms, and on dating, all of the dating apps on your phones, and they would target women that way. And they would figure out and get these women and go on a date that wasn't a date at all. They would end up taken to a hotel and gang raped. And ultimately that was how they were trafficked, because they would say, if you don't continue to do this, then I will kill your children. I will harm your family. So it's an easy way for them to go after them, but it's, important to try and figure out how they were recruited.
Okay, so I'm going to insert here real quickly that the number one trafficker is familial, meaning it's some kind of family member. And the number two is the Romeo trafficker that Jennifer referred to, the fake boyfriend. And then all the other traffickers move on down from there. But just so you know, over 90%, over 95% of all victims think they know their trafficker. So the guy in the mall will give a compliment, but he won't just abduct at the moment. He's going to groom and get that person, make them think they have. Only 3% of trafficking is kidnapping. So trafficking happens with somebody you think either you've met them online or that kind of thing. And by the way, a UN study showed that 60% of traffickers are women. So it might be a woman complimenting a woman in the mall, and it's not necessarily a man. Yes, the buyers are men. The other thing is she referred to this story of the mall, which was actually a study that was done of men who were incarcerated for exploiting minors. And if you go on our website, warinternational.org, and you go to the media section and you look for the interview, there's a half-hour interview with Amy Allen. If some of you listened to the Zoom that we did with Amy Allen, who is the forensic victims' rights expert, she talks about that very study on there. And that interview with her is one of the most profound interviews. And then Jennifer was also referring to lures, how people get lured. And we have 21 lures that we identify in our training day. But yes, low self-esteem is one of the lures. And if you listen to that interview on our website, you will hear Amy talk about how predators said it's really easy to pick their victim. They just look for low self-esteem and how they identify that. Right.
Okay, next slide. So when you're speaking with someone, try and figure out where did she live. Kind of one thing before you go, before kind of leading into this, I think one of the things that people think about when they hear about human trafficking is that somebody's chained up, you know, that they were held in locks and chains or all of these different things. And that's typically not what happens. That's pretty low on the bar of what's actually happening. So you want to figure out, where did she live? Were others there? Did she travel there alone? Did they all travel around together? Were they separated or kept together? Medical, what did she do if she was sick? Was she allowed to go to a doctor? Was she taken anywhere? You know, sometimes the traffickers do take the girls to the doctors or the hospital, and they obviously don't steer far from them when they're there, and they're very cautious to be standing there when they're interviewed to figure out what's going on and what's wrong with them. But you want to try and figure out if they were allowed to go anywhere when they were ill.
So I'm going to interrupt here real quick. The most cited study is Laura Lederer. 88% of all human trafficking victims, while they're being trafficked, went and saw a healthcare professional and were not identified. That is a stunning statistic. And what happens when a lawyer or a cop or a parent, school teacher, medical professional, authority figure doesn't see beneath the surface and look below and look, you know, see beneath the surface? It underlines the lie of the trafficker. You don't exist. Nobody cares about you. And we have, when we do our medical training for medical professionals, we play clips of all these kids that were trafficked, some from their homes and their bedrooms, and saw medical professionals all the time and were never identified. And so we talk about separating the players. You know how to do that when it's domestic violence. It's the same principle. And so if you're a medical professional, I know we have at least a doctor and a nurse on here right now, and you know, tell the companion, who you may or may not think is the trafficker, I have to take her to the x-ray room. You guys get to make up nonsense. You can say that she doesn't need an x-ray, but you just go to the loft with her to the x-ray room and separate the person that's doing all the answering. And so, yes, in the medical setting, I wouldn't say what do you do if you're ill, but I would say what happens when you're ill, you know, that kind of thing. So yes, 88% will see a medical professional and never be identified.
And then, you know, were there guards or locked doors? And then try it, you know, location, was she moved or did she stay in one place? Like, you're just trying to get as much information as possible on kind of the story of their trafficking. Because again, you really want them to be able to tell the story and what happened with them. And so if you can get as much information as possible from what happened to them during the time that they were trafficked, then it will help build the case going forward. Next slide. Okay, so there's also could have been threats and intimidation. So when you're asking questions, were they allowed outside or by yourself? Were they always chaperoned? If they felt free to leave, if they wanted to, were threats made against them or their family? Were they touched or did men have sex with them? Did you witness threats made against others? And so the others could have been others in that same place, others against their family. You want to figure out what kind of kept them in that situation. What did the trafficker do to continue to allow them to be trafficked? What did their situation look like? The next one.
One of the things that I learned to do on that, do you have the freedom to come and go, is we actually invited some waitresses to come to an event. There was a concert that they acted interested in. And we said, hey, we'll come pick you up. And they said, oh, we have to get permission. These were adults. They were in their 20s. And so we deliberately said that to see if they had the freedom to come and go to something like that without getting permission, because we were going to come get them on their off hours.
Yeah. So, I mean, just some things that don't make sense, like Becky's talking about, like if it doesn't make sense or you feel like, wait, what? Then you want to try and, ask some follow-up questions from them, being conversational and not, pointing anything at them, but you want to try and get as much information as you can. So some cautions from victims: don't interview them like a suspect or like they did something wrong. That kind of, some of these in building the rapport, it's like, you don't want to come in, you're coming in hot. Like if somebody's coming in to talk to you, if you think you're going to go on a date with them or you might have an interest in them, and they just come in and they're super close to you and they just start firing questions at you, like, where are you from? What did you do? You're like, okay, we're done. I'm just going to need you to move on. That's the complete opposite of what you want to do when you're trying to interview a victim. Accusatory words or demeanor, again, they're not going to elicit information from them. Trauma can affect behavior and memory. Correct chronological order may come later if you have established safety and trust. And I think, again, that just goes to what we started with, that trauma is the backdrop of this whole thing, which can cause things not to come out what we would think correctly. And by correctly, it's because we're used to linear information. And if it doesn't come out that way, we think that it's an automatic lie. So begin to build rapport with the suspected victim even before they have been rescued. Prostitution is not a choice. This is just, if you continue to see someone in that sort of situation, don't act judgmental, don't be accusatory or judgmental. You want to try and build rapport with them. So if you do have the opportunity to speak with them, that they will trust you and feel like that you're someone that they can come to and trust and be rescued. And then survivors can experience a trauma trigger and then become fearful, causing them to appear uncooperative. Again, I think that's just kind of been a running theme, that the biggest thing that trafficker or that victims have is trauma. And so you don't want to be accusatory or judgmental or shut them down, because what you want to do is allow them to tell their story. And so if another thing is if you continue to interrupt them, one thing that's important is you want to listen to hear, not to respond. So if you're hearing them and trying to already think of the next question, or that doesn't make sense, or I need to ask this, you're truly not listening to them and not allowing them to tell their story. And so you're going to miss key points, key information, and you're going to miss things. Again, one thing when you're trying to interview a victim is give them the power back. I think Becky talked about this, but I can't remember. There's a difference between compliance and consent. And so you want to allow them to have the power. They have had to be compliant for, years or however long in order to survive. That doesn't mean that they consented to that. So you want to give them the power during the interview to be able to tell their story, stop telling their story when they're fearful or tired of it, and then not shame them, not shut them down, and understand that things are not going to come out linearly. And I think that the next slide is just contact information.
Okay, so the 1-888-373-7888 is the government Polaris number. And the lady I was hiding in my car when COVID hit in Michigan had called that number because she was being trafficked, and they told her she wasn't a trafficking victim. She said, if you don't rescue me, I'm going to be dead. And they said, oh, you're suicidal. So they gave her the National Suicide Hotline, which gave her our number. Anyway, she was a trafficking victim. And she has put her life, she's flourishing today. She's a legal secretary now, and she's the one we bought the car for. And I got an email from her today that she's doing her driver's ed. She had a car before, but she just wants to, the rules have changed. It's been so long. So she's actually taking a test on Tuesday. And then she will be able to have a car to drive herself to work. But I want you to call that number because America lives or dies, sinks or swims by numbers, by statistics. We want to know how many people were rescued. And no trafficker fills out a census report and says 33 girls tonight, 11 of them were kids. So you call that number, they're not 911. They're not going to run out and help you, but they are supposed to call the police in the area that you called about, and then it will rise or fall by how well the police are trained in that area. And in fact, most states, police are not mandated yet to be trained in anti-trafficking. And so it sinks or swims, but I still want you to call that number. Most of our survivors hate it when we give out that number, but please call it, but don't stop there. So when a woman attended one of our CFRs and her daughter was trafficked a year later, she called that number, but her daughter was 18, so they wouldn't talk to her. And in that case, she's like, well, she was chained, you know, she can't call you. And they're like, sorry. So she didn't quit there. She called us and we called the FBI, who picked her up in a raid, and that family is reunited today. But for sure, call that number. Our number is 1-877-END-SLAVERY. If you can't remember that government number, remember end slavery.